We're very fortunate to be joined this evening by three fantastic speakers. In alphabetical order, they are the Victorian Shadow Treasurer, David Davis, Senator Gerard Rennick from Queensland, and West Australian Senator Ben Small. So I'm going to hand over first to David to say a few remarks, and then I'll hand over to the senators.
Xavier, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and to my senator colleagues Rennick and Small, and to the members of the Griffith Society. It's always a pleasure to speak to this group and to interact with them. And I think the society, founded as it is on the ideas and concepts of Sir Samuel Griffith, the founding father, with his commitment to federalism, the rights of self-governing communities, and to a true federation. I think there's a lot to highlight from the recent events, and some of the wisdom of the early founders does come to the fore. The events highlight the adaptability of the Federation and the Australian Constitution, and I think that this is actually an important test and tension. I mean, constitutions and the rights of communities in this format that we discuss them are, of course, not static things. They face events, they face the challenges that come forward, in this case with COVID-19. And there's a few things to say. The Commonwealth Constitution, an act of the British Parliament voted on by Australians by plebiscites in the 6 states in the 1890s, established the mechanism for the Commonwealth of Australia, ceding defined powers to the Commonwealth. And it's true that the Commonwealth has massively expanded its powers and encroached successively on areas of state responsibility, creating often areas of duplication and overlap and chaotic costing and funding miasmas. Yet many of the key powers of the states actually do remain intact. And we've seen big pointers to that over the recent period, some recent High Court decisions under Williams, but none more important than what has happened through this period of the COVID pandemic and the health challenge that the states and the nation have faced. And, you know, the question of how the jurisdiction should interact is an important one, and it goes back prior to Federation. There were mechanisms for the states, or the colonies as they were then, to interact, and the mechanisms for interaction of the jurisdictions continue to adapt. I, for one, put on record that I think there needs to be a more robust way than the National Cabinet. I think the National Cabinet has proved useful and proved to provide guidance to states and the sharing of ideas, and I mean, in some senses, a talk shop and an opportunity to share experts across jurisdictions, which makes absolute perfect sense. It's probably not a robust enough arrangement to last and deal with some of the more complex matters that come forward from time to time. And we obviously, and I'm looking at much of this as in a new role as Shadow Treasurer, we do need to make sure that there is, you know, very muscular push from the states on a number of these important areas. But I think what has been interesting is the states have gone their separate ways on a number of things. There's been some commonality. There's been a roadmap, as people will know recently, but there's been significant divergence. And I think that divergence is actually important and part of the essence of what our federation is in fact about. It's probably worth noting early on that health remains a key power of the states and territories, the states in particular, and that is to the fore. The Commonwealth has, over recent years, and going back to the health agreements, muscled in on many of the state areas. But what's come clear is that this public health area and the ancient powers that exist for public health interventions are intact at a state level. Now, how they're exercised is another question. But those powers are necessary powers, and I say this as a former health minister. You know, Victoria was passing laws on vaccination and public health interventions in the early 1850s. 1854, there was a compulsory vaccination act in the Victorian Parliament. And so these powers are ancient powers, they are state powers, and they are intact. But the variation across the Federation, I think, is actually quite important. My colleagues from Western Australia and Queensland have faced a different set of challenges, and their jurisdictions have dealt with these matters differently. That's actually the essence of the Federation. Victoria, of course, has gone its particular way, and in truth, we are the standout bad performer of the Federation. We achieved that triple outcome, a trifecta, as it were, of the huge number of lockdowns, the greatest number of lockdowns worldwide in 263 days of lockdown, a terrible record to have achieved. But we also had the most deaths, and it's up over 1,000 now, but 800 through that, more than 800 tragically in that second wave of the pandemic in 2020. You know, growing out into the building out from July and August and September and October last year, more than 800 people lost their lives in Victoria, and that was not replicated elsewhere around the country. This is very important for people to understand. But we've also had the most economic damage, and the damage to small business, to employment, all of these has been greater in Victoria than in any other jurisdiction. So I actually say, if you want the very best argument for federation and for a federal system, we've actually seen it. Would you have wanted the blunders and mismanagement of Victoria replicated at a national level and imposed right across the whole country? That is the question I would ask, and I think the answer is no. The particularity of decisions made in different jurisdictions is important, and the appropriateness for their circumstances is important. But one of the aims of a federation is to disperse power, to break up power, and to provide for that local decision making. So I say, imagine if it was everywhere in the way it was here. The Royal Commission that we've said is needed is a very important outcome, and I make a couple of points here. Not only the management and technical aspects of the pandemic decisions needs to be looked at, but actually the impact on rights and liberties, people's businesses, and people, you know, that decision to lock down the housing towers was done on very flimsy information, very flimsy background. And there's a point here. The pandemic has seen a massive expansion of executive power in Victoria, the like of which we really have not seen outside wartime. And that grab for power, that decision making. Now, I'm not arguing. I make it clear that there should be none of those executive decisions. Some of those were clearly necessary and proper, but the excessive grab for power and the lack of balancing accountability and transparency is a real worry. The Public Health and Wellbeing Act has at its core proportionality and transparency and accountability. They have not been heeded to, and you know, I have pushed very hard to see the briefings that lie behind each of the public health orders. They have not been provided, never, not once. And, you know, I say, if you're exercising over here great power, that needs to be balanced with checks and accountability and transparency. And I think if your business is being closed or your kid's not allowed to go to school, you're entitled to see the reasons in full. Sadly, the government has fought hard to prevent that, and to date they've been successful. Even in FOI cases, they've defied the orders of the Parliament. The Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee has got a watchdog role in the state parliament. It has not discharged that properly. It has been very weak, and there's an area need real for reform there. So a massive growth in executive power, and again, you wouldn't want that replicated around the country in quite the same way. And what I would also say is the state has brought in a new pandemic bill, which we think, well, certainly my view, having considered it closely and sought very broad advice on it, is a real attack on the rights and liberties of Victorians. It is unjustified in the way it's framed, and there is insufficient balancing and checks on executive power in this bill. I only imagine the Premier has sought these powers because he intends to use them, and that I think is a real concern. I think I only had 5 minutes. I think I've probably used pretty much all of it. It is worth noting that this tension within the Federation is important, and the innovation that's happened at different states, things that are done on a public health level in one state that work well are replicated in another state. But errors that are made are naturally not replicated. So I think the Federation has served us well through this period. That doesn't mean that there aren't criticisms and things to be pointed at. The tension in the national constitution between the freedom of movement and intercourse and goods and people, but amongst the states, what does absolutely free mean? It clearly doesn't mean absolutely free movement, because that is what has been decided. And certainly that was also true in the 1918 influenza pandemic. There were border controls. There were decisions made by states to protect their communities. And some of these decisions were right. Some of them were excessive. That is why in Victoria's case, we are very keen for a Royal Commission after a change of government to examine all of these decisions, to open up the questions and about not only the management and mismanagement of the pandemic in our state, but also the infringements on people's rights and liberties, businesses. The impact on people has been very severe. Thank you.
Thank you for those insights, David. I'll hand over now to Senator Rennick.
Hi, guys. Thanks, Xavier. Look, I've got when I first ran for politics in my maiden speech, I said, look, there was nothing more damaging to this country than the vertical fiscal imbalance between the state and federal government and the ambiguous responsibilities. I said that prior to the bushfires and prior to COVID, and given the way that it's been handled by the various levels of government in this country, both the bushfires and COVID, I'm only more convinced of what I said in my maiden speech. I think our federation is a dog's breakfast. I think our constitution has been completely trashed. The words free movement, to quote the Shadow Treasurer there, mean just that. They mean free movement. The High Court decision in Palmer v WA, whereby premiers can use the precautionary principle to shut down state borders, is so ambiguous and dangerously ambiguous, because the premiers can now basically use any risk whatsoever to stop free movement between the states. Now, at the end of the day, while I'm a proud Queenslander, I'm even prouder Australian. And, I want to see our country be a country, not a federation of 6 states. Effectively, I think we've splintered into 8 totalitarian regimes funded by a joint bank account at the federal level of government. There's so many areas of our constitution that has been trashed in the last 18 months, notwithstanding Section 92, Section 117, freedom of religion, Section 5123A that says effectively you cannot coerce doctors and nurses into administering vaccines. I cannot stand the National Cabinet that go in there, and I'm already on the record as saying I'm going to vote against anything that makes the National Cabinet a subcommittee of the Federal Cabinet. There is no way I want unelected premiers making decisions at a national level. It is a cabinet without a parliament. I'm actually done with the states. I'd get rid of the states tomorrow and go to 50 super regionals. In Queensland, Brisbane does not serve the regions. It is nothing more than a bureaucratic administrative centre, whereby the state now is held to ransom by bureaucrats. And we're seeing that, for example, in Queensland Health today, where 4,000 frontline workers have been stood down because the backroom bureaucrats have decided they all need to get vaccinated rather than just using a simple COVID rapid test. I totally disagree with the fact that we've used the Australian military on borders. I do not know why we support state premiers in doing things that to me are just the complete antithesis of what certainly the LNP up here stand for. We believe in freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, freedom of expression, and yet people are not allowed to do that because we have state governments mandating vaccinations. Now, we have come out and said we support voluntary vaccinations, but despite that, we stand there and still subsidise states to enforce their mandatory rules. I don't know why we indemnify them. I don't know why we subsidise them. As for the idea that, states control health and still have the major reins over that, I dispute that. Yeah, sure, in terms of public health, but we fund private health. We fund Medicare. We fund the PBS scheme. We fund, all that money spent through Medicare. We do the deals with vaccinations. So yet again, it's a dog's breakfast as to who's ultimately accountable for good health outcomes. Yet again, same for education. We're responsible for funding private schools to an extent and universities. The states do public primary and secondary. So yet again, who's responsible for education? We've got the same modus operandi with state premiers, whereby they come out all the time and say they never have enough funding. And that's because, they do rely, I think I'll stand to be corrected here, but 80% of the revenue raised in Australia is raised by the federal government, 17% by state governments and 3% by councils. And yet it's the councils, I think, who deliver the majority of frontline services, and then the state governments, and then the federation, the federal government least. So I think we need to, hold a constitutional convention, and we really need to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the states, because if we continue to go down the path of where we're going, whereby the state premiers continue to wedge the federal government, and it'll always be worse when the coalition's in power. And I'll give you an example. In 2009, when the Victorian bushfires killed 180 people in one day, the coalition did not blame Kevin Rudd for the bushfires, or did not blame Kevin Rudd for climate change. That same year, the swine flu outbreak occurred. 191 people of an average mortality at the average age of 48 died. We did not blame, and Nicola Roxon was warned. She was advised by the bureaucrats to shut down, and she said, as if I'm going to shut down the country. But did we sit there and try and wedge Nicola Roxon and create hysteria? No. So it is not in our interests, and this is why I don't think that the National Cabinet works either. The Prime Minister in a room full of 8 people will always be outnumbered. Okay, the Prime Minister stands up there, number one. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. Either we clarify the roles and responsibilities of the state government so that states completely fund themselves, or we abolish the states altogether and push down the service delivery down to actual regional council level, including health, education, most things. I'd keep defence national, shooting off the hip here a bit, get rid of payroll tax, bring back stamp duty at a national level. And effectively let the regions collect their own royalties. The regions charge land tax. Now, in places like Sydney, for example, where they mightn't collect much royalties from minerals, they'll be able to charge land tax, and vice versa out in the regions where land values mightn't be as high, they can collect money from royalties. So they get a lot more autonomy. And basically, I'd split the politicians at state level. I actually think federally we need a lot more politicians. I'm in the Senate, and I do not get enough time to interrogate the bureaucrats. We have not had any more politicians at a federal level since 1984, despite the fact the number of people in Australia has doubled. The social media commitments have doubled. The committees have doubled. The number of bureaucrats have not, probably trebled. So we are not doing a good job at the federal level holding the bureaucrats to account. And likewise, I think it's probably fair to say at the local level, they need more support and more people on the ground. And if we get rid of that layer of government, we'll have a lot more accountability. So possibly going against the grain here, but if we do another decade of what we've just been through in the last 18 months, I fear for Australia's future.
Thank you, Senator Rennick. I know that we're going to have a very robust and interesting discussion this evening, but I'll hand over now to Senator Small, who's been waiting very patiently. So over to you, Senator.
Yeah, thanks, Xavier. And I think any discussion of federalism in Australia needs to start with the exception of Western Australia. And it's no different tonight because I'm coming to you from behind the Iron Curtain in quarantine. But I guess fundamentally, and from a sort of first principles perspective, I believe in our Constitution because it empowers our citizenry to have the maximum degree of autonomy that's possible. And ultimately, I think that does tend to drive better economic decision-making and more rationality. Obviously, the context for tonight's discussion, as we heard from the two previous speakers, is undoubtedly shaped by the pandemic. And I think David Davis's point that the states have not actually been granted a single additional power by the Commonwealth since the onset of the pandemic, but rather they are exercising powers that they have always had, is fundamental to tonight's discussion, because whilst the realpolitik in Australia for a long time, and with both persuasions of government in power, has been to centralise decision-making and power in Canberra, that is also matched by, I think, an expectation on the part of Australians that the federal government will swoop in and fix it. And often the business community are first amongst those calling for homogeneity across the country. And that has very negative consequences, of course, where the federal government makes poor decisions or the policies that the federal government adopts nationwide aren't tested in a competitive federalistic way. So I don't want to, detract too much from the conversation tonight. And Gerard's got some big ideas. I guess my perspective is perhaps a little more constrained, but I do see two key areas of national conversation in the short to medium term where we can actually leverage the consequences of the pandemic to achieve something that I think society members would love to see. And the two key areas really are in education, because there's no doubt that Australian students have been through 18 months of hell, and the long-term effect of the homeschooling and the deprivation, particularly for Victorian and New South Welsh kids, will remain to be seen. But we've got to understand, of course, that's off a low base, because our PISA scores have been declining since the mid-2000s, despite huge levels of increased funding from the Commonwealth. So I think in terms of overcoming the impacts of the pandemic and arresting the sort of national decline in education standards, that's imperative for setting Australia up to diversify our economy and improve our prosperity as a nation going forward. And the other key one, which I think both speakers touched on in different ways, is that the conversation around vertical fiscal imbalance can't take place in isolation from a conversation around horizontal fiscal equalisation. And of course, the coalition government did change the GST deal and introduce the floor, which I think has in some ways ameliorated the tendency of horizontal fiscal equalisation to disincentivise particular jurisdictions from investing in productive infrastructure. So I think that where we're looking at a federal budget that is frankly on fire, the country having amassed an unprecedented amount of peacetime debt that we have, the opportunity is now to talk into the short and medium term how we potentially reshape both our Commonwealth and state taxation systems to address some of those issues and disincentives in a way that you could never have that discussion outside of the context of a pandemic. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Senator. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue of horizontal fiscal equalisation, because I think the Society will have a bit of a publication on this subject of VFI and HFE in the next week or so, which may be of interest to people. But look, moving into the next portion of this evening's discussion, I want to start first with a question. I think each of the speakers have touched on this already to some extent, but I want to move first to a question that I might ask for perhaps not a one-word answer, but maybe a one-sentence answer from each of the speakers, although I understand the risks in asking politicians to keep things that concise. What do you think about this issue of federalism in the pandemic? Has federalism been an asset or a disadvantage to the nation during the pandemic? I might start with Senator Small.
Yeah, tough one to be really brief on, but I think in essence, it has been an advantage because it shows the power of having decision-making closest to those that decision-making impacts. And it also highlights the benefits of those various approaches to a particular issue being juxtaposed directly.
Perhaps an understandable position from a West Australian, but I think maybe Senator Rennick, you may have a different view, I suspect.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I'd have to say it's been a disadvantage. We've had different rules. We've seen families kept apart from coming home. You know, there's been people who have died in Queensland, for example, and their family members can't come back from New South Wales. We've had mothers in northern New South Wales who can't get to the border and, you know, over the border into Brisbane. We've seen the states get funded to a large degree. So the feds have picked up 50% of health funding with very little accountability over that. Likewise, we're seeing it again with the vaccinations. We say, you know, it's not, you can't be taken under coercion, and yet here the states are mandating it. So I think that, and in a state as big as Queensland, you know, northern Queensland at times have had to wear masks, and there hasn't been one case of COVID in North Queensland. They've been shaking their heads going, well, what are you doing? Or likewise with Cairns, tourism's been destroyed because people can't come from New South Wales or Victoria, even though there's no cases of COVID in Cairns or the Gold Coast. So, yeah, I mean, it's had different impacts, but you know, and I mean, I'll accept Queensland's a little bit different because it is such a big state, so there has been different regional differences within that.
Certainly.
I'd also say that the regional differences in Victoria are significant too. There's been areas of the state that haven't had COVID that have been locked down. But to me, the overriding thing with the Federation is, imagine if you'd had the mistakes made in Victoria made by a central government in Canberra controlling everything. It would have been a disaster. Imagine WA being treated in the same way as metropolitan Melbourne by a decision maker in Canberra. It would have been an absolute disaster. Now, I in no way criticise my federal colleagues per se, but the Federation is about dispersing risk and saying you can actually make decisions closer. Now, sometimes governments get those decisions right and sometimes they get them wrong. In the case of Victoria, we got them spectacularly wrong with massive economic damage, more deaths than anywhere else, and actually longer lockdown. We actually got the worst trifecta. But imagine if that had been replicated at a national level and imposed across the whole country like a blanket.
I have to say, I think David makes a particularly convincing argument there, although I think it's good to see that we're already having a diversity of views in our first question. I think that leads us nicely into the next question I want to ask this evening, which is where you each see the greatest opportunity for federation reform coming out of the pandemic. And hopefully we are now finally starting to come out of the pandemic. I might stick with you, David, if you'd like to go first.
I agree with my Western Australian colleague about horizontal fiscal arrangements. Victoria looks at this uniquely. We're the great loser out of the Federation. We've lost every single year since 1901. We've been cross-subsidising other states and continue to do it. Now, it's true that WA has actually had a very rough run on this in this recent period. I accept that. But we've put more in every single year of the Federation that has come back to us. And to that extent, I agree with indeed my opponent here in Victoria, but I also agree with the new Premier in New South Wales. I think much of what he's pointed to is correct. And there are, you know, in the end, the intrusion of the Commonwealth through the financial power into the position of the states has created many of these duplications, many of these overlaps. It's my humble view that the Commonwealth ought not to have been continually pushing and encroaching into areas that are quite properly state responsibility. There are those weaknesses, the financial power, the series of cases during the war and the decisions during the Second World War, which saw income tax move to the Commonwealth in the way it did, and the inability of the states to initiate reform. I mean, we still have, and it's a former state premier in Western Australia who ran what I think was a very important set of points about state-initiated referenda and the inability of, that weakness in the Constitution that prevents states, even in combination, initiating some proposal for referenda and reform of the Constitution. So there's, the Constitution is a pretty good document. If you think about it internationally, it's lasted, it's been flexible. It doesn't mean it's perfect.
Thanks, David. I might ask you, Senator Rennick, to weigh in next. I think probably you've got some different ideas.
Yeah, sure do. So obviously, if you want to bring power closer to the people, then wouldn't 50 super regionals be better? I mean, Cairns is 2,000 kilometres from Brisbane. People in Cairns or Townsville, which is 1,400 kilometres from Brisbane, don't feel as though they get a say in even the running of Queensland. So my answer to dividing power, I'm all for that. Certainly don't want a centralised power base, but why not devolve it right down into the regional level? And have a vibrant, competitive 50 region structure versus then what I'd call an uneven, dysfunctional 8-state system whereby you've got, Northern Territory with 250,000 people, Tasmania with 400,000, Canberra with 400,000, SA with about 1.5, WA with 2.5, and then New South Wales, for example, would have more people than those 4 territories combined. So it's not like you've got an even playing field there. And likewise, even in New South Wales, people at the Tweeder and Moree probably feel closer to Brisbane, for example, or Queensland in some respects than, Sydney. So I think by all means devolve power, but go even further than the state level. Now, as for the fiscal equality and the way that money's spent, I'm not quite sure why David thinks Victoria's been pulling its weight. I mean, if you look at the exports, WA by far leads the country with 40% of exports, followed by Queensland with 20% of exports. I think between the two states, it's closer to 65 or 2/3 of the country. Victoria gets a lot of head offices where, as a result, BHP's head office is in Melbourne, for example. Most of the head offices are in Melbourne and Sydney, so they collect a lot of payroll tax on those head offices. They also collect a lot of land tax from those super salaried white-collared blowhards in the ivory palaces that, other states don't get. So, WA, for example, has had a really slow housing growth this year. So their land values, the WA, while it picks up a lot in royalties, won't be picking up much on land values. So the idea that, Victoria is missing out, I don't agree with, and especially with GST calculations. That is not calculated at point of sale. That is calculated at where the GST return is done. And because there are more head offices in Sydney or Melbourne, they get a higher share of the, this claim that, we don't get all the GST. And I know this, so I've worked for Westfield in Sydney. There was a company there before they sort of split and sold up called Carindale Property Trust, which was one, shopping centre in Queensland. That was lodged, the GST return for that was lodged in New South Wales. So that was counted as GST collected by New South Wales, even though the GST was never even collected at all. It was actually a Queensland company. And that's the thing people don't understand with GST. It's actually calculated on who lodges the tax return and from what head office it's lodged at rather than at the point of sale. So this is the conversation that we need to have in the vertical fiscal imbalance and as well. But the best way to do that is to match responsibilities with revenue raising powers so that you don't have to transfer wealth or transfer taxes in this way, because, you can slice and dice it so many different ways that you'll never get a clear outcome. The only way to do it is say, right, you're responsible for this, 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 and this, and here are your revenue raising powers, and we're not going to fund you anything. And whether or not you could do that to 100% of the funding, I would doubt. But the more you can do that and reduce the amount of that states or, if I had my way, super regionals rely.
The super regionals the super regionals will just be rolled over by a central Commonwealth government. They will be like small councils that are just playthings. To be honest, and if you don't have the strong constitutional position of the states, you will actually have centralised power. That's my humble view.
Well, I was about to say I felt I needed to give David Davis the right of reply there, but I think we haven't heard yet on this question from Senator Small. So, Senator, do you have anything you'd like to add? I think you touched on a couple of points in your introductory remarks, but any further elaboration?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I have to give credit to Senator Rennick there for the super salaried, white-collared blowhards in ivory towers, which I think is an amazing expression I might have to steal. And any conversation around GST would naturally need to include things like gambling revenues that it previously hasn't. But I think fundamentally, if I could maybe take the conversation back to, and we'll spend a bit of time on this, I'm sure, but the other key one is education. And the problem with our national curriculum is I guess clearly demonstrated in our declining results even before the pandemic. And it comes at the same time as we've seen, the national requirement for the delivery of Aboriginal heritage, sustainability, and the like delivered in all subjects. So clearly that's got nothing to do with maths. Our kids can't count, and yet we're insistent on delivery of climate change awareness in all subjects. So it is frankly absurd. So I guess a return to state-based curricula that are in competitive tension, that's a way that I see us actually embracing some sort of normalisation in terms of state versus federal responsibility. And it's one that, if we're truly believers in federation, should deliver better outcomes over time. So I think that's in some ways more possible or more plausible as an outcome in a national conversation than some of the grander ideas. And it's certainly one that I think that the evidence points to quite clearly.
Well, I think you're pointed very strongly to the fact that as national intervention and national funding is ramped up, performance and outcomes have literally fallen. So that is a very worrying trend. It shows that the amount of money is not the only factor, but it also shows the intervention and the layers of Commonwealth interference are a problem in some of these areas. And the same could be said in certain areas of health. As a former health minister, I mean, I see things come across my desk where, people were wanting a national approach to this or a national approach to that. Whenever the national approach came through, I knew what that meant for Victoria. We generally had a higher standard, and generally what a national approach meant is we either had to bring everyone up to our standard where we paid more and got the same, or alternatively we had to lower our standard where we paid the same and got less. For many states, and I don't know about all of them, but for many states, the national approach meant more meddling and sets of standards that were laid out at a national level that would work, certainly in Victoria's case, to our disadvantage overwhelmingly in a number of cases.
That's a great point. And to be honest, I guess the risk in any conversation around these sorts of subjects is that you actually end up with a worse outcome. And I mean, take, for instance, the US, where you see both local, state and federal governments all levying income tax in some jurisdictions. So if you live in New York, you pay New York City income tax, you pay New York State income tax, and you pay federal income tax. So where it's not delineated in both a conversation around the responsibilities of government as much as it is around revenue raising and other elements of government, that's a key problem.
I think you're all touching on some really important issues there, and I'm loath to move the conversation on, but there was one final question I wanted to get to before we open up to general questions from the audience. I might start with you, Senator Rennick, and then come back to the other two. Because I think you've proposed some quite interesting ideas already this evening. The final question is, what should we as a nation, and perhaps you might interpret that also to include different communities, different states, what should we be trying to achieve out of any reform to the Federation coming out of the pandemic?
Oh, that's easy. Better outcomes, better government delivery. So, we need to get control of our sovereignty back. We need lower taxes, higher productivity. We've probably got more natural resources per head of the population than any other country in the world. And yet somehow we've slid in the last decade to have $1 trillion in debt. Large chunks of our, wealth and infrastructure owned by foreigners. We seem to be toadies to, international organisations. And can I say, I do believe in the United Nations, but I think it's a negotiating body, not a governing body. Coming back to education, for example, while I do think centralisation is not a good thing for education, we can't overlook the fact that the long march of the left through our bureaucratic institutions, they have so much power today. And I actually think now I don't divide the world between left and right anymore. I divide it between the blowhards, in the corporations, which are socialist by nature. They have limited liability through unions, through super funds, and through the bureaucrats. These people dictate the term, and they probably constitute 15% of the population and have, 70 or 80% of the power. Versus the people who go to work every day, put their nose to the grindstone. And I feel like a net zero is a classic example. I mean, we've just signed up to net zero. And could have fooled me. I can tell you what, there's no one in my base that wants net zero. They all think it's a load of rubbish. So we need to, get rid of the foreign debt, reduce our debt. And we're running surpluses at the moment too. This is what's very frustrating. God forbid when we, the iron ore price crashes and, we're running trade deficits again. I don't know how we're going to get our, pay our debt off. So that to me, and the way to do that is through better government services, go back to building infrastructure again like we used to. The problem with superannuation is that they only buy infrastructure, they don't build infrastructure. And we've taken this neoliberal ideology too far, where we've got this idea that, the market's going to build infrastructure. Well, infrastructure is all long tail. It can take decades to build and generate a return. Private market will never do that. And we've got super funds and foreign organisations who own the existing infrastructure. They don't want any more infrastructure built because that's going to compete with their existing infrastructure, right? So, it really worries me, the power of superannuation funds. They have over $3 trillion in wealth, which $1 trillion invested overseas. And the rights of the individuals are severely eroded. 10% of everyone's income goes to someone they haven't met, well, excluding self-managed super funds, someone they haven't met, and there's no guarantee they're going to get it back at 60. I don't know about you, but was there ever a referendum that said someone could take 10% of my income and give it to someone I've never met? Don't think so. We now have got, governments dictating health choices to us. Yet again, in my maiden speech, I said, the last 30 years we've sold all our infrastructure and then effectively marched on into the, governments have effectively marched on into the classroom, the bedroom, the family home. They've since then marched into the hospital waiting ward. They've marched into the corporate boardroom. So, look, we need to give greater power back to the individual, I guess, and deliver better out, which they are the people who will deliver the outcomes and weaken the power of the bureaucracy in those bigger organisations where, it's not just centralisation of power in Canberra in terms of government power, the centralisation of our wealth through superannuation funds. There's centralisation of decision-making through bureaucrats. There's a higher ratio of bureaucrats to politicians. And there's also a greater power, I think, of corporations and things like just in education with childcare now. Children are being shipped off into childcare from such a young age. My daughter now has to sing Welcome to Country and all that sort of stuff from a young age, and they're taught to sort of be ashamed of their past. So, we need to get control of our institutions as well.
I just pick up one point made by Senator on infrastructure. There is a lot of infrastructure that we do need, but it's being terribly mismanaged at the moment. So there's enormous waste. Money is being squandered. Scoping is not being done properly on many of these major projects. So, we look at this in Victoria. We've got some very big and some quite good projects. But, you know, a tunnel like the Metro Tunnel, which is a needed piece of infrastructure, begins at 11 billion, but it's likely more than 15 billion already now. And because of the cost blowouts and the mismanagement of the project. Now, these huge cost blowouts, you know, people, they're sort of, on one level, they sound, you know, it's a sort of just a number. But to give people some idea of that project, you know, it's blown out from 11 to 15, nearly 15. And, you know, that's 4 Royal Children's Hospitals is the kind of scale that you're talking about with these things. So it's not only the infrastructure and the need for infrastructure, but it's got to be tightly managed. We've got to get competitive pressures into some of these contractual arrangements. And, you know, that is sapping our state's position. And I think this is an issue around the country too.
And I think I totally agree with both gents. And if I could sum up this way, Xavier, Ronald Reagan said it best when he said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language were I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I think if we can get back to government not being the solution to every problem, we will have put the Federation in a fundamentally more, much stronger position.